I'm an agricultural engineer, but my degree from the University of Agriculture, or the University of Alberta, was in agriculture. And when I was at school, I always used to enjoy wearing my green Aggie jacket into engineering classes and see what kind of a disruption I would cause. And one of the best days was the day the dean was there lecturing and saw me in the crowd in my jacket and said, "Who let that guy in here?" So I always enjoyed that. Early in my career, I actually was a member of AIA, so I have some connections to the organization. When I thought about the theme of this event being people and resources, I thought about my industry, the cattle and beef industry, and what I would call the almost famous Alberta beef brand. It struck me how people and resources were such a critical part of our industry. They're really what I would see as the foundation of the Alberta beef industry and the Alberta beef story. I think it's fair to say there's some cracks in that foundation, but I'm an engineer and I've worked enough with concrete to know that concrete can crack, and will crack in fact, and can still retain its structural integrity. We have to watch the cracks to make sure they don't start to affect the structure, but we can continue with that. I'm going to begin with some full disclosure. I am a shameless thief of PowerPoint slides. My view's always been, if somebody else creates a really good slide, why would I waste a lot of time trying to do a slide that won't be as good? But I always ask permission and I always give credit. So the pictures and a lot of the history was from a presentation done by Dr. Reynold Bergen, the Science Director of the Beef Cattle Research Council. Hui-Ting Wang from the Canfax Research Service provided me with the charts and the numbers, but most of the words are mine. So our industry is an industry with a long history, rich heritage, strong traditions, the Alberta beef industry. I work for Alberta Beef Producers. We are the producer organization that speaks and works in Alberta on behalf of close to 20,000 beef producers. So that's my role in it. But I do want to begin with a little bit of the history of our industry. Certainly, I think it's an understanding of history, or knowledge of history helps us to understand the present. Knowing history and understanding the present helps us to anticipate the future. So that's why I think it's important to begin with a little bit of a history. So the beginning of our industry, that last slide you saw with Alberta Beef Producers said since 1969, that's when our organization started as a commission. We trace the beginnings of the cattle industry to 1874. So when we have slides that just say Alberta Beef and not Alberta Beef Producers, we say since 1874. And really the history of the industry began with the loss of the large bison herds across North America, and the Northwest Mounted Police, the forerunner of the RCMP, being sent to Alberta to stop the whiskey trade and bring law and order to the West. And that's really what they came. The bison herds were gone. The people that were living in Western Canada needed protein. And so at that time, a few strong, innovative, and I would say far-sighted and resilient people started to use the natural resources of this province to raise cattle. And that's the first documented ranching operation was 1874, John McDougall at Morley. Obviously there were cattle here before that, but that's where we trace the beginnings of it. And what attracted them and what formed the foundation for the beef industry were abundant grasslands, adequate water supplies, and a favorable climate. And if you look at this 140 years later, we really still have all three of those conditions in this province. So people have sometimes said, you know, we may stop raising cattle in Alberta, people will be raising them somewhere else, but I think as long as we retain those three factors, there will be cattle raised here. We have 50 million acres of farmland in Alberta, 28 million acres of that is rangeland, pastures, and forage land, so we still retain it. The early ranches were a lot of venture capitalists, long-term leases, large ranches, some famous ranch names, the McIntyre, the Bar U, the Cochrane Ranch. Somebody told me once at one time most of the rangeland in southern Alberta was in the hands of 5 large ranchers. So it was a lot of venture capital. They had long-term leases. They were serving the local year-round markets because they had markets for beef with the Northwest Mounted Police, with the First Nations people, and with the workers building the Canadian National Railway. It was seasonal, range-based production. It was based on year-round grazing. They started out with longhorn cattle from the United States, but then started quickly moving to British cattle. As I say, the basis for it was year-round grazing because in southern Alberta you can do year-round grazing most years. A couple of really hard years showed people that you couldn't count on year-round grazing every year. There was a couple of years where we had a lot of snow, Chinooks that melted the snow, then cold weather that formed a really hard crust on the snow. There was huge losses of cattle, and so the producers then started to collect hay and grain in the summer for feeding in the winter, recognizing they couldn't do year-round grazing all the time. Obviously, you need a place to process the beef. So the first packer in Alberta was Pat Burns, Senator Patrick Burns. This is in 1890. That's a plant that my very first job was working for a bricklayer doing renovations on that plant in Calgary. Once they built a packing plant, then they realized that if the calves are all born at the same time and they're all ready for market at the same time, that isn't a very efficient way to run a packing plant. So they started creating holding herds to hold cattle so they'd have a more continuous supply of cattle for their plant. And really that was the beginning of the feedlot industry in the province, this holding herds. Then in the 1900s, with the railway finished, then there was the major settlement of Alberta. I always thought that the settlement of Alberta and the prairies and the farmland occurred over a long period of time, but really about a 10-year period from 1900 to 1910, most of the farmland in this province was settled. And as they started doing that, the leases were smaller, they were shorter term on some of this land. The land was being broken up for farming, a lot of it. And a lot of the farmers and ranchers that started breaking up land, they still had cattle too on the marginal land and on land that wasn't really suitable for growing crops. So they kept cattle as well. We had a large influx of settlers and mixed farms. From 21 to 51, we started using more grain to finish cattle. And you sometimes get the impression from people looking at our industry that grain finishing of cattle is relatively new. It actually started a long time ago. Basically, in 1930, 10% of cattle were getting some grain, and by 1940, almost all of them were getting grain. So grain finishing of cattle is not new. We changed breeds to the continental breeds. The Charolais, Limousin, Simmental started coming in the 70s. In the 1980s and 1990s, the crow rate, which was really a subsidy that was used to move Western grain to seaports for export, the effect that it had to do was it wasn't just export grain that was moving on the railway at that subsidized rate, it was also feed grain. So for a long time in Alberta, we were raising cows, raising grain, and sending both of them to Eastern Canada to get put together. With the elimination of the crow rate, we started keeping the grain here. There was major expansion of feedlots, so we had more and larger feedlots, larger packing plants. You see the numbers there. There was over 20 packing plants in Alberta and Saskatchewan in the 70s. There were 6 in 1982. Now we have 2 large ones and 2 smaller ones. So there's really been a concentration there. In 1989, Cargill started the High River plant, and in the 1990s we had a tremendous explosion in feedlot development. Where we are now, so the story to this point, cattle industry in Alberta is $4.8 billion a year in farm cash receipts. In 2015, we had a huge price spike, and our farm cash receipts in cattle actually went to $5.2 billion out of about $12 to $13 billion. So it's 30 to 40% of farm cash receipts in the province. We basically have what we see as 3 major sectors: the cow-calf, the feeding, and the processing. Of course, among the raising of the cattle, there's a lot of mixing. So cow-calf producers keep cattle for varying lengths of time. There's just a lot of mixing. A lot of feedlot operators also have cows. So there's a lot of mixing, a lot of movement. Overall in the country, we have 40% of the cows, 70% of the cattle feeding, and 70% of the beef packing in Canada. So when we talk about Alberta as the heart of the cattle industry in Canada, we always say that respectfully to our colleagues from other provinces, but we have a pretty strong case to make for that. There's how the beef cows are in. Darcy showed a picture. 40% of the cows are in Alberta. Between Alberta and Saskatchewan, we have 70% of the cows, and the 4 western provinces have 87% of the cows. So there's a lot of cattle producers in Ontario, but as far as their percentage of the Canadian cow herd, it's not a very large percentage. The average size of herds, and I want to put averages in perspective here. They say 182, 162 head is the average herd across Canada, 254 head. That's total cattle. I think the important thing to remember about averages is that it's made up of a whole bunch of numbers that are probably a long ways away from the average. We say there's close to 20,000 producers in this province, according to the 2011 census. It'll be down in 2016, I'm sure, the number. A quarter of those producers have fewer than 18 cows. Another quarter have between 18 and 48, and only a quarter of them have over 122 cows. So the number of producers for whom their cattle operation is a big part of their lives or their income is certainly not close to 20,000. It's a much smaller number. So the average number of cows is 85, but it's made up of those ranges. And this is an industry where if you were going to be raising cattle full-time and that was going to be your only source of income, people are suggesting it's close to 400 cows is the size that would be needed for that. We produced 2.7 billion pounds of beef in 2015, and there you see the domestic slaughters in blue, and the black is the live slaughter exports, that cattle that go to the United States directly for export. So they're raised and fed here, and then they go directly to the United States. And you see the fluctuation. You can see that black line in 2003 for live slaughter exports. That was after BSE. So in 2004, there were little or no, 3-4, there were very few live slaughter exports. We consume 62% of the beef we produce in Canada, and we export 38% of it, 27% of it to the United States. So we are overly dependent on a single customer. It's a very good customer. When we had BSE here and all the borders closed around the world, and people said, well, the US border closed, and it did, but they're also the first country to open their border, to reopen their border to our beef. So they're a good customer. We still don't want to be that dependent on it. We've made arguments with the provincial government about the climate levy that we are the ultimate in trade exposed industry, and we were corrected by our friends in the pork industry who said, well, we export 38%, they export 70%. If you look at the Alberta beef industry, though, 84% of our beef leaves this province. So a lot of it goes to the rest of Canada, and a lot of it goes to export. Typically, we export beef from Western Canada. We import beef into Eastern Canada because we have higher production here and fewer people. Eastern Canada has much lower production and more people. But we are obviously very significantly affected by trade. So we consume about 900,000 tons of carcass weight equivalent beef. You can see the trends that have happened with the competing proteins. And our competition is beef producers in other countries, but our competition also is other sources of protein in our own country. And you can see that poultry per capita consumption has been rising steadily. Beef and pork have been somewhat declining. We are at about just around 40 pounds per person per capita in beef consumption. By contrast, the Americans are close to 60 pounds. And the difference in our per capita beef consumption between Canada and the United States is over half of our exports. The need for over half of our exports is because of the difference in our per capita consumption. This is where our exports go. You can see again the trend in our exports, how high, they were higher in 2004-05. They've gone down and up. Arguably, the movement, a lot of our exports are affected by the value of the Canadian dollar. They're also affected by our market access. So the blue is the United States, by far our biggest market. Our other top 5 markets are China, Hong Kong, Japan, Mexico, and South Korea. So that's where we're looking to send. And we always talk about China and Hong Kong because for a long time, because of BSE, we weren't allowed to sell beef to China, but we could sell beef to Hong Kong, which all of us thought was part of China. But we could sell beef to Hong Kong, and it could go from Hong Kong into China. And so that's the way we get around a lot of the restrictions in China, is we sell to Hong Kong and then it goes in there. So it's a pretty significant market for it. So the story of the people and the resources of our industry, as we knew it, as we were coming into the last 10 or 15 years, people always say, cattlemen in southern Alberta said, you know, we built our feeding industry in southern Alberta on a low Canadian dollar, relatively cheap feed grains, and export markets. Until the late 1980s, Canada was about self-sufficient in beef. We exported some from the west, we imported some into the east, but on balance we were self-sufficient, so we weren't at a situation that we are now where 38% of our beef is exported. So that was where we were. Then the story changed. So in 2002 the Canadian dollar started rising. 2003 BSE reduces export market access. For a while it eliminated export market access. We're still not back to where we were before 2003. People are saying, well, you know, when you're looking back at BSE, and I said, we won't look back on it as long as we're still facing export market restrictions, and we are. In 2006, feed grain costs started rising, largely as a result of the Americans' movement into ethanol production. That put tremendous upward pressure on feed grain costs. If you look at the Canadian dollar, you can see the kind of crazy fluctuations we've seen in the Canadian dollar, from 64 cents in 2002 up over par and then back down. This graph's interesting because you see that really sharp decline in 2008 here. And if you look at charts of the TSX and charts of calf prices from that same period of 2008, all of them did exactly that. It shows you the extent to which economic activity can affect our industry. But the industry is built on a low Canadian dollar. We've adapted relatively well to the higher Canadian dollar. I think there were a lot of people in our industry that thought we couldn't survive. The benefit of a low Canadian dollar for us, of course, is on exports. We're also purchasing our inputs in Canadian dollars, and we're basically facing a North American beef price that's really set in US dollars. So a low Canadian dollar could be quite an advantage, and the higher dollar tends to work against us. You see what happened in 2002 and 3. The blue was the consumption in 2003, Canadian consumption. Saw what happened with export markets. And the only reason that's not lower than that is the Americans reopened their border pretty quickly. Canada is one of the few countries in the world where domestic consumption actually went up when BSE was discovered, and that was the people of Canada supporting our industry. Feed grain prices, you see what happened when I mentioned 2006, what's happened with the upward pressure on pricing due to ethanol. Ethanol is a double-edged sword. If you're a feedlot that's close to an ethanol plant, you're paying more for feed, but you also have the benefit of getting byproducts from the ethanol plant. But if you're not close to the plant, all that you're facing is higher feed prices as a result of it. So we talk about agricultural producers needing to be resilient, and I think certainly for grain producers that have spent the winter looking at almost 1 million acres of unharvested grain sitting under the snow in fields, that's a test of resilience. Our industry, we had a 10-year test. Cattle producers, drought in 2002, BSE in 2003, RCAF in 2004, that was blocking our moves to expand our market access into the United States. Biofuels policies that increased the cost of feed, the dollar changing, feed grain prices continuing to rise, country of origin labeling in the United States coming in 2008, that was costing our industry $600 million a year. The global economic crash really hurts the beef industry. As people have more money, they tend to buy more beef. That's a truth that we know from marketing. And hurting, when the economy suffers, beef sales suffer. 2009, we had drought again. The economy hadn't recovered. 2010, we had excess moisture in some parts of the province, drought of the country, drought in other parts. Prices started to improve. Finally, in 2011, things started to get better for the industry. Talk about excess moisture and drought. There was a cattle producer in Manitoba that got a disaster payment for drought in the flooding in the spring and drought in the summer in the same year one year. So here we are. Our social license, and Darcy talked about this, that was the theme of our annual report this year. There's a theme that's been running through our last few reports. One year it was a year of change, then it was making changes work, then it was traveling new trails, now it's social license. So you can see that as an industry we're facing the need to move around and change. 2017, where are we? We have positive developments in the industry. Prices are down sharply in 2016 from record high prices in 2015. For a long time people talked about how exciting it would be if calves were in the fall were worth $2 a pound. In 2015 we blew right through $2 to $3 a pound. Unfortunately people quickly, it was only 1 year, but they quickly got used to that price. So when the prices came back down to just under $2 a pound in 2016, there was a lot of consternation in the industry, and we had people phoning our office and saying, boy, the prices have crashed since last year. I said, well, you do realize last year was an all-time record, and you couldn't expect it to stay there, and that the prices in 2016 are still higher than any time over the last 20 years, except for last year. Anyway, that didn't help. One of our marketing guys said, you know, high prices are good, but profits are exciting, and that's what we try to get people to look at, but boy, those high prices seduce people really quickly. We have relatively good moisture supplies. Obviously last fall, too much moisture in a lot of areas of the province, but we did end up with pretty good feed supplies. We've continued low inventories of cattle. One of the things that's kept prices fairly strong is both Canada and the United States went through long periods where the cattle herds declined. we still haven't started rebuilding our herd in Canada. It's been staying pretty steady, small losses, tiny gains, but sitting pretty steady. The Americans were getting ready when 2011-12 when prices got good. The Americans were ready to expand their herd pretty quickly. Drought kept them from doing it. As soon as the drought eased, their herd expansion went ahead very strongly. So the high prices in 2015 were caused by unprecedented tight supplies of all three of pork, poultry, and beef. By 2016, the Americans produced 2 billion pounds more meat in 2016 than they did in 2015. Of course, that put strong downward pressure on the price. So the herd expansion continues in the United States. We're not seeing any sign of rebuilding yet. Our latest numbers from January 1st don't show signs of us expanding our cow herd. We have had some good trade developments. At the end of 2015, mandatory country of origin labeling was repealed. It was ruled 3 times by the WTO that this is clearly an unfair trade barrier, and the U.S. finally got to the point where they were facing our ability to impose about $1 billion a year worth of retaliatory tariffs, and they repealed mandatory country of origin labeling. Mexico finally started taking over 30-month-old beef from Canada. We actually are back into the Korean market. We're looking at Europe, the comprehensive economic and trade agreement with Europe. It's an enticing prospect for us. Europe's got a lot of people. It's still relatively wealthy in the EU. These are people that would buy our product. But we haven't solved the technical barriers related to getting beef into Europe. We have tariffs reduced. We have large volumes of beef that can go there. Europe is still sticking on a couple of points because there's a couple of carcass wash interventions that we use in our plants here, effectively lemon juice and vinegar, that they seem really concerned about. We're kind of wondering where the big problem is, but it's a citric acid and an oxyacetic acid that our plants use to control bacteria in the plants, and Europe is not allowing us to use those, and our plants are not willing to walk away from that food safety thing. So we need those technical barriers. Harmony Beef is a plant just north of Calgary at Balzac, and it's been it was originally started as Rancher's Beef, went into bankruptcy, was purchased by an American with a long experience in the processing industry. He came up here, started working on the plant, went through a long, arduous battle with the municipality over a water supply. He's finally, last month, started slaughtering beef, so that's exciting. The plant's not huge. As he puts it, he said, we're big enough to be meaningful and small enough to be nimble. So that's good news for the industry to have another packing plant. Globally, we look at growing populations and growing wealth, which, as I said, will have positive impacts on consumption of beef and demand for beef. I talked about the prices in 2015, and you can see what happened with all three of calf, steer, and finished animal prices. They all took off tremendously. And as you can see, in 2016, even though they were down, they were still far above where they'd been for most of the past 10 to 20 years. So certainly there was quite a lot of volatility, but still good. The retail price of beef, because of short supplies and everything, finally caught the consumer price index in 2015. So beef had always lagged behind, and you can see on that chart, as we went through 2014, increases in the price of beef had always lagged way behind the consumer price index. 2015 was a sharp upswing, and all it did was bring it in line with the CPI. But again, that caused some reaction among consumers, and we raised some concerns in our industry about, we know that at some level people will turn to other proteins and stop purchasing beef. The good news for us is demand is holding strong. And we talk about a demand index, and what that is really a measurement of the willingness of producers to keep buying beef even though the price has increased. Normally, as prices go up, demand goes down. That's a relatively simple rule of economics. The demand index is the willingness of people to continue to buy beef. And I think what's happened is people are looking at other proteins as sort of staple proteins. When they wanted a meal where they would have had beef in the past, they're still willing to pay the prices. So we think that's very positive, but we also know there's a limit to that. Anyone who thinks it's an easy industry, this is returns for cow-calf producers. You saw what happened in 14 and 15, tremendous. There's a lot of years there when it's negative returns for that industry. And then if you really like risk, you can go into the feedlot industry. So feedlots made huge profits in 14-15 and gave all of it and more back in 15-16. So the feedlot operator told me some of the numbers we've looked, the long-term average margins on feedlots are in the order of like $10 or $15 an animal, and this is on an animal that represents $1,500 worth of inventory. So it's a business where you really need to enjoy risk. And I admire the people that do it. So the story, so I talked about the positive developments in 2017, the challenges, and Darcy alluded to this too, and we have the same situation. The whole social license, public trust, all of those situations, consumer trends, the A&W commercials, when they began their campaign and called it Better Beef, that was really bothersome to us. A&W can sell beef that's raised however they want it raised, but we really reject the notion that they can call it better beef compared to the beef that the vast majority of Canadian producers raise. We had the Earls situation last year where Earls said we're buying beef from the United States because we can't get enough beef that meets our requirements here in Canada. That caused quite an uproar, and the people of Alberta actually, and through their impact on the stores in Alberta, reversed that decision. Their vice president, one of their marketing people said at the beginning, we think people care more about how the beef's raised than where it comes from. Well, it turned out people in Alberta really cared about where the beef came from. But the whole public trust, the sustainability is an issue. We have challenges from the whole government legislations and policy, the farm and ranch safety issues are a concern, the impacts of the climate levy on our industry. I said we are a trade exposed industry, and so the cattle feeder in Alberta is competing for calves with a cattle feeder in Nebraska who's not facing a carbon levy, and the processing plants in Alberta compete with their sister plants in the United States who also don't face those levies. So there's a challenge there. Certainly the new U.S. administration, we don't know where it's going on trade, so NAFTA, I mean if we got to suggest what the changes to NAFTA, there's some changes that would be good for our industry, but I'm not sure we're going to get to do that. The Trump administration is seen as anti-trade, so all of the people in the United States that support country of origin labeling see an opportunity to convince that. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was hugely important to Canada because it would give us much better access to the Japanese market. Of course, the U.S. has pulled out of that. So there was a meeting this week of the rest of the countries trying to resurrect it, but that's a problem. And then, just in case we weren't having enough challenges, we had TB discovered in a cow in Alberta. So that's a situation that hasn't had any impact, very much impact on the industry as a whole, but it's surely been devastating for the producers that are affected by it. Here's a bunch of producers who sell their calves every fall. Now they couldn't move their calves. They're holding their calves. It's been a very difficult situation. The governments, to their credit, have done their best to try and help these producers, and both federal and provincial governments, but it's been a challenge for us. So our people and resource challenges, we are competing for scarce resources. Land, water. People don't consider air a resource, but I would suggest to you that clean air is a resource. In other words, if you're having any impact on that air, then you're making clean air into a scarce resource. And certainly, I come from a time before people talked about carbon as a pollutant and carbon dioxide as a pollutant, but it's certainly in the public eye now. Cattle produce methane. And right now, the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan is talking about a 45% reduction in methane in the oil and gas sector. I think it would be naive for us to think that the oil and gas sector will always be the focus of methane reductions, and that causes us concern in our industry. Even if we're able to compete for those resources, we have other land uses competing for the land. We have a lot of it. There's pressure on the resource use. So the use of grazing land, a lot of public land in Alberta is used for grazing. There's pressure on our ability to do that. This government likes the idea of parks, and then the question will be, are we allowed to continue grazing cattle if land gets turned into a park? Our view is that you can protect rangeland really well by leaving it in the hands of the people who are managing it properly now and grazing it, not by turning it into a park. But we're doing that. The local regional plans, the whole climate leadership plan. We talk about people and resources. There's certainly fewer people available to our industry, both the owner-operators of the ranches and those who need labor. So we're seeing some succession on farms. We're seeing some young people to come back into the industry. That 10 years of bad news that I showed you kept a lot of young people saying, yeah, I love cattle, but I don't think I like them that much. But we're starting to see that, but we need succession plans and financing plans. Public and consumers, again, those are people. And you might say, well, the public and the consumers are the same people, and sometimes they are, but we look at them as two different groups. Consumers are the people who buy our product. Public are the people who give us the social license to raise our product, to use the resources, to use our knowledge, to use our technology. High level of trade and political uncertainty, and of course that's tied to people and resources. And obviously anything that has an impact on our infrastructure, that 70% of the feeding industry and 70% of the packing industry that we have in Alberta is really important to the 40% of the cows, the people that are raising those cows. That infrastructure is important. So the future is we still have strong, innovative, and resilient people in Alberta. That's the strong point. We still have natural resources, not as abundant, perhaps, or there's more competition for them than there once was, but we still have grass, farmland, and water. There's more people in the world, which will create more demand for high-quality protein, and this is a really good place to raise cattle. We have a really good climate, we have very good genetics, we have people who know how to raise cattle. So it's a very good place to raise cattle, and I think we can remain a competitive producer of high-quality beef. I used to have this in quotes, but then I started looking it up, and I don't think Darwin ever actually said this, but all of Darwin's work would lead you to this conclusion, that it's not the strongest or the most intelligent that survive, but the ones that are most adaptive to change, and I think that's been the story of our industry. So thank you.